Destiny is a cruel architect that often builds the foundations of global empires upon the ruins of a young man's purest, most innocent love. Before the world trembled at the name of the emperor, there was only a thin, angry boy who dreamed not of conquering Europe, but of liberating a rock in the Mediterranean that had rejected him. The air in Ajaccio is not like the air in Paris. It carries the heavy salt of the Mediterranean and the sharp, resinous scent of the maquis scrubland that clings to the granite cliffs like a desperate lover. In the year 1769, this rugged island of Corsica was a wound that refused to close. The French armies of King Louis XV had descended upon the island to claim a debt owed by Genoa, crushing the fierce local resistance at the Battle of Ponte Novo. It was in this atmosphere of defeated pride and smoldering rebellion that Letizia Romolino, a woman of steel and beauty, carried the future master of Europe in her womb while fleeing the chaos of war on horseback. The child was born into a world where the very soil beneath his feet was a contested battleground between ancient independence and foreign subjugation. The house on the Rue Saint-Charles in Ajaccio was a place of shadows and murmurs. Here, the young Napoleone Bonaparte grew up with eyes that seemed too large and too intense for his pale face. He did not look towards the opulence of Versailles with envy. He looked towards the mountains where the exiled hero Pasquale Paoli had once led the free Corsican Republic. To the young Napoleone, Paoli was a demigod, a figure of classical virtue carved from the same stone as Plutarch's heroes. The boy would sit for hours staring at the sea, imagining the return of the general, visualizing the fleets that would drive the hated French occupants back to the continent. Every French soldier patrolling the cobblestone streets of Ajaccio was a personal insult to his heritage, a reminder of the chains that bound his beloved motherland. However, the tragedy of his early life was situated closer to the hearth. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a man of charm and flexibility rather than rigid principle. While Letizia bore the silent dignity of the defeated, Carlo pragmatically embraced the conquerors to secure the survival of his family. He wore the velvet and powdered wigs of the French aristocracy, learned their language, and petitioned their court for titles and favors. To the young, idealistic Napoleone, this smelled faintly of betrayal. He watched his father bow to the French governors, striving to prove a nobility that the Corsicans deemed irrelevant and the French deemed rustic. This internal conflict created a fissure in the boy's soul. He loved his father, yet he despised the necessity of submission. At 9 years old, this tension manifested in a temper that was as volatile as the island storms. He was a child of the old nobility, yet poor, a citizen of France, yet a foreigner in spirit. The heavy wooden furniture of their ancestral home seemed to absorb his brooding silence. He began to understand that to liberate Corsica, he would first have to master the tools of the oppressor. He would have to leave the sun-drenched cliffs of Ajaccio and enter the cold, gray belly of the beast. The decision was made that he would be educated in France, paid for by the very king he secretly loathed. As he prepared to board the ship that would take him away from the scent of the maquis, he made a silent vow to return not as a servant of the lily, but as the sword of Paoli. He did not yet know that the island he worshipped would one day break his heart more violently than any cannonball. The transition from the sun-drenched cliffs of Corsica to the damp, austere plains of Champagne in northern France was a physical and psychological shock that nearly broke the spirit of the young Napoleone. In the winter of 1779, he arrived at the Royal Military School of Brienne, a solitary figure of 10 years old, speaking a dialect of Italian that sounded guttural and foreign to the refined ears of his French masters and peers. The academy was a cold, imposing structure of gray stone, surrounded by high walls that seemed designed as much to keep the students in as the world out. Here, the warmth of the Mediterranean was replaced by a pervasive, bone-chilling dampness that seeped through the thin wool of his uniform. Brienne was a microcosm of the Ancien Regime, a world rigidly stratified by ancient titles and ancestral wealth. The other cadets were mostly the sons of marquises and dukes, boys who had known nothing but privilege and who viewed the scholarship student from a recently conquered island with open disdain. They mocked his name, pronouncing it with exaggerated Italian inflection. They ridiculed his father for being a petty noble who begged for scraps from the French court, and they laughed at his ferocious, defensive pride. To them, he was merely the Corsican, a semi-civilized savage who belonged more to the goats of his island than to the officer corps of His Most Christian Majesty, the King of France. The isolation was absolute. He had no friends, no confidants, and no refuge save for the fortress of his own mind. In response to this relentless psychological siege, the boy retreated inward, constructing an armor of impenetrable stoicism. He learned early that to show emotion among wolves was to invite destruction. He spent his free hours not in the playful fencing matches of his peers, but buried in the library, consuming histories of Rome and Greece like a starving man. He found solace in Plutarch's Lives, reading of Spartan discipline and Roman fortitude, convincing himself that he was not a rejected outcast, but a man of superior antique virtue, trapped among decadent fops. Every insult hurled at him in the courtyard had only hardened his resolve, fueling a cold, calculating ambition that began to smolder beneath the surface of his sullen demeanor. The legend of the great snowball fight at Brienne is often told as a charming anecdote of his early tactical genius, yet the reality was far more somber. During a particularly brutal winter, when the snow lay deep in the courtyard, the other boys began to organize a chaotic melee. Napoleone, emerging from his self-imposed exile, took command not out of camaraderie, but out of a desperate need to impose order on chaos. He organized the students into platoons, built intricate defensive fortifications of packed ice, and directed the volley of snowballs with the seriousness of an artillery barrage. For a few hours, the boys who despised him obeyed him, recognizing an innate authority that transcended their titles. Yet, the snow melted, the hierarchy returned. He remained the outsider, the brilliant savage who had learned that command was the only way to ensure respect in a hostile world. The French monarchy believed it was educating a servant. In reality, in the cold crucible of Brienne, they were forging the instrument of their own eventual undoing. The year 1789 cracked the foundation of Europe like a hammer striking brittle glass. In Paris, the mob stormed the Bastille, tearing down the ancient symbol of royal tyranny stone by stone, drunk on the intoxicating new wine of liberty, equality, and fraternity. To the rest of the world, this was the dawn of a terrifying new age of chaos and possibility. But to the young Lieutenant Bonaparte, stationed in the sleepy garrison of Austerlitz, the French Revolution was not a philosophical awakening regarding the rights of man. It was a geopolitical opportunity. While his fellow officers debated the fate of the king or fled into exile to protect their aristocratic necks, Napoleon saw the crumbling of the French monarchy as the loosening of the chains around his beloved Corsica. The chaos in Paris meant that the grip of Versailles on its distant provinces was weakening, and in that weakness, the young patriot saw the path to his island's salvation. He was 20 years old, a thin and intense artillery officer with a complexion yellowed by malaria and eyes that burned with a feverish intensity. He did not care for the mobs of Paris. His heart beat only for the granite cliffs of Ajaccio. He immediately requested leave, abandoning his post in France to return to the island that had haunted his dreams since childhood. He arrived in Corsica not as a conqueror, but as a pilgrim returning to a holy land. He wore the blue uniform of France, but beneath the wool and brass buttons, his loyalty was entirely devoted to the dream of an independent republic. He believed that the revolution's principles could be weaponized to justify Corsica's secession, a beautiful irony where France's own ideology would be the instrument of its territorial loss. The emotional core of this return was his desperate desire to stand before Pasquale Paoli. The old general had returned from his long exile in England, greeted by the islanders as a messiah. Napoleon approached him with the reverence of a disciple approaching a master, offering his sword and his French military training to the cause of liberty. He envisioned a glorious partnership where he, the young wolf of war, would serve as the right hand to Paoli, the wise lion of statecraft. He wrote pamphlets, organized local militias, and threw himself into the turbulent politics of the island with a ferocity that alarmed the more conservative elders. He was convinced that destiny had written this moment, that his suffering at Brienne and his isolation in the French army were merely the price he had paid to acquire the skills necessary to free his people. However, the Corsica he returned to was not the unified paradise of his memory. It was a viper's nest of clan feuds, petty vendettas, and shifting alliances. The revolutionary fervor had turned neighbor against neighbor, and the young officer found himself walking a razor's edge. He spoke of radical Jacobin ideals, of overthrowing the old order, not realizing that Paoli was a man of the old order, conservative and suspicious of the violent extremism radiating from Paris. Napoleon was blind to the widening gulf between them. He was drunk on the idea of glory, projecting his own ambitions onto a landscape that was far more treacherous than he understood. He believed he was the hero of the story, the prodigal son returning to save the fatherland, unaware that in the eyes of his idol, he was merely the son of a collaborator, tainted by the very French uniform he wore with such complex pride. The disintegration of a hero is a tragedy far more painful than the loss of a battle. For Napoleon, the year 1793 was the year the pedestal crumbled, revealing that the god he worshipped was merely a man of petty jealousies and archaic loyalties. The tension between the young artillery officer and the aging General Paoli had ripened into a poisonous fruit. Paoli, looking down from his position of absolute authority, saw in Napoleon not a brilliant protege, but an arrogant upstart, a dangerous radical infected by the godless disease of the French Jacobins. The general began to freeze the Bonaparte family out of his inner circle, treating their loyalty with a cold, aristocratic disdain that cut deeper than any knife. The breaking point arrived with the disastrous expedition to La Maddalena, a small archipelago off the coast of Sardinia. The French Republic, eager to export its revolution, ordered an invasion, and Napoleon was given his first true command of artillery. He prepared with meticulous obsession, drilling his men and calculating trajectories, eager to prove his worth to Paoli. But the operation was doomed by sabotage and incompetence from the very start. The Corsican sailors, loyal only to Paoli and secretly instructed to ensure the failure of the French expedition, mutinied. Napoleon found himself standing on a rocky outcrop, firing at his cannons with desperate fury while his own support ships fled the scene. He was forced to spike his beloved guns and retreat in humiliation, a failure orchestrated by the very man he sought to impress. When he returned to Ajaccio, burning with shame and anger, he expected a tribunal. Instead, he found a political earthquake. Paoli had finally made his move. He formally denounced the French Republic, declaring that Corsica would sever its ties with Paris and seek the protection of Great Britain. The implications were catastrophic. To follow Paoli meant betraying France, the nation that had educated him and given him his commission. But to stay loyal to France meant becoming a traitor to Corsica, the land of his birth. The binary choice tore at his soul. He wrote desperate letters trying to bridge the chasm, but Paoli's response was a thunderbolt of rejection. The general publicly condemned the Bonaparte brothers, sneering that they were born of filth and that their father had been a collaborator. The psychological impact of this rejection cannot be overstated. The father figure of his entire existence, the man whose portrait hung above his bed, had not just rejected him, he had erased the honor of his family. The realization hit Napoleon with the force of a physical blow. His dream of a free Corsica was a lie. There was no place for him here. The hero of his youth had become the tyrant of his adulthood. In this crucible of betrayal, the romantic Corsican patriot began to die, and something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous began to take his place. He realized that if he could not be the liberator of his homeland, he would have to become its conqueror. The illusion of benevolent leadership was shattered, replaced by a cynical understanding that power is the only truth that matters. He stood alone in the streets of Ajaccio, watching the gathering storm clouds, knowing that the island he loved was now preparing to kill him. The end of the dream did not come with a whimper, but with the roar of a malt and the smell of smoke. In May of 1793, the final decree was issued from the Paulist Assembly. The Bonapartes were declared traitors to the fatherland, and their property was to be seized or destroyed. The island that Napoleon had worshipped, the soil he had longed to liberate, had now turned its fangs upon him. The young officer was not in Ajaccio when the hammer fell. He was miles away, trying to rally support, leaving his mother and younger siblings vulnerable in the family home. It was Letizia, the formidable matriarch, who woke to the sound of partisans surrounding their house, chanting for the death of her sons. With the stoic courage of a Roman matron, she gathered her children in the dead of night. They did not leave with the dignity of nobility. They fled like criminals, escaping through the back alleys and disappearing into the rugged maquis that covered the hillsides. For days, the future imperial family slept on the bare earth, hidden by the dense scrub, listening to the distant shouts of men who had once been their neighbors. They moved towards the coast, a ragged procession of refugees, hungry and exhausted, their silk clothes torn by thorns. From a high vantage point, Napoleon later rejoined them, and together they looked back towards Ajaccio. They saw the smoke rising from their estate, the physical manifestation of their erasure. The library where he had studied Plutarch, the garden where he had dreamed of glory, all of it was being consumed by the hatred of the very people he had wanted to save. The escape was a chaotic scramble onto a French frigate bound for Toulon. As the ship pulled away from the harbor, cutting through the sapphire waters of the Mediterranean, Napoleon stood at the stern, his eyes fixed on the receding coastline of Corsica. It was a funeral for his identity. He had spent 24 years trying to be the hero of this small, rocky island, and it had rejected him with violent finality. As the granite cliffs faded into the mist, something profound shifted in the tectonic plates of his soul. The romantic, idealistic Napoleone died in those waters. He turned his back on the past, on Paoli, and on the provincial dreams of island independence. He turned his face toward France, not as a patriot, but as a man who had learned that the only way to impose one's will on the world is through absolute, terrifying power. He arrived in France a penniless refugee with a foreign accent, but he brought with him a fire that would soon consume all of Europe. The Corsican was dead. The emperor was born. History is often written in the ink of irony. Had Pasquale Paoli accepted the young lieutenant, had the island of Corsica embraced its prodigal son, Napoleon Bonaparte would likely have lived and died as a minor local dignitary, a footnote in the dusty archives of a forgotten republic. He would have been happy, perhaps, but he would have been ordinary. It was the pain of rejection, the burning of his home, and the crushing of his first dream that forged the diamond-hard ambition necessary to conquer the world. The failure in Corsica was the essential fuel for the victory at Austerlitz. He lost an island, but in doing so, he gained an empire. The emperor now sleeps in the Invalids, but his shadow still lengthens across the map of Europe. If you wish to stand amidst the smoke of history and witness the rise of giants, subscribe to this channel. Together we shall uncover the heavy price of glory.